Welcome to the Tactics Meeting, episode 75. Today's guest is Matt Baer, who was the Federal On-Scene Coordinator for the Golden Ray Salvage and Wreck Removal. It's going to be an excellent episode, so stick around. This episode of the Tactics Meeting is brought to you in part by Gallagher Marine Systems. Gallagher Marine Systems is the industry's most comprehensive source of full-service, in-depth compliance support. And by Portage-based Solutions, makers of Easy 213. They have been helping a variety of firms in our industry with custom application and database development for close to 15 years. Well, it's time for the Tactics Meeting, a program where we talk to subject matter experts about response, tactics, and technology. I'm your host, Dan Smiley, and today I'm excited to have with us Matt Baer, Coast Guard captain, retired, and the previous Federal On-Scene Coordinator for the Golden Ray Salvage and Wreck Removal, one of the most complicated and long-lasting responses outside of the Deepwater Horizon in U.S. history, and now also the Deputy Director of Emergency Services for Gallagher Marine Systems, arguably the largest QI spill management team organization in the country. Welcome to the program.
Hey, Dan, thanks very much for having me. It's an honor to get to be on a show where I've listened to some of your podcasts already.
Well, that's great. It's always nice to have a listener as a guest. Well, let's start off with who you are. You spent a whole career in the United States Coast Guard and somehow found your way into the emergency response side. You know, there's the law enforcement side, there's the search and rescue side, there's the ship drivers, there's the Airedales, and then there's the pollution response, emergency response guys. Where did you fit into that puzzle, and how did you get into emergency response?
Well, Dan, so I started my Coast Guard career back in 1994 when I graduated high school, and I went on to the Coast Guard Academy, graduating from there in 1998. And then, really, the first almost 10 years of my career, I was doing the law enforcement, search and rescue, homeland security missions of the Coast Guard. Spent time on several cutters. Spent some time out in your neck of the woods out there in Puget Sound as the commanding officer of Coast Guard Station Seattle. And a little more on that later, but that's was my first response ever, was out during that time there in probably 2005. I was the boat coxswain of one of our 41-foot utility boats, and I got to deliver some pollution investigators slash responders from Sector Puget Sound out to the scene of a spill. Fast forward on to the rest of my career, spent some time in the deployable specialized forces. Commanded a maritime safety and security team down in Kings Bay, Georgia. Served at Camp Lejeune here in North Carolina, where I'm based right now, as the executive officer of our Special Missions Training Center. And then I transferred to Sector Charleston in 2018. And at that point in time, I was a commander, and I was in charge of response operations in South Carolina and Georgia, predominantly search and rescue with some homeland security, but also really my first major foray into the world of marine environmental response. So I served as a federal on-scene coordinator's representative there. I was delegated some FOSC authority from the sector commander of Sector Charleston. And then that fateful day in September of 2019, when we got the call about the Golden Ray, I realized that I didn't quite know how to spell oil yet, but I was going to be in charge of something much bigger than I could imagine.
Yeah, that's quite a challenge. Let's back up to 2005 when you were driving the boat coxswain. Which spill was that?
Honestly, Dan, I'd be lying to you if I could tell you I remember that. I was 20, oh gosh, 29 years old then. I was more worried about driving the boat. It was not a major spill. I will say that, and it wasn't even a minor spill, but it was a spill we had to go investigate. So that really was the first opportunity I had to really get into that world. Prior to that, I served at then Group Hampton Roads in Virginia, and we had a combined command center there with then MSO Hampton Roads. And so took in as a watchstand an awful lot of NRC, a lot of calls coming in that we would then call to the NRC. But back then, as a lieutenant, junior grade lieutenant, I was much more of a watchstander and not a decision maker at all on those. I followed a quick response card, a QRC, which we still use as qualified individuals at Gallagher Marine Systems. QRC certainly make sure you do the right thing the right way at the right time every time.
Yeah, right. I think the spill you were talking about was the Delco Passage. Was it the south end of Vashon Island?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, that was the spill that ultimately turned out to have come from the Arco, Texas. A-
Okay.
And while you were driving the Coast Guard small boat, I was driving the OSRV Grebe for Clean Sound Cooperative. So we probably passed each other out there
We
off
probably
Maury
threw our
Island.
hands and waved at one another.
A little of that. Roger that. So let's talk about Golden Ray. So that ship, for those who don't know, is a car carrier. It's coming out of it was the port of Charleston, right? It's coming out
It was actually the port of Brunswick, Georgia.
coming out of Brunswick. Um, as I recall, it turns out that they had decided not to take on extra ballast water in the river because they didn't want all that river silt in their ballast water tank. And they were just a little too close to metacentric height, and they made the turn uh, to head out to sea. And as she started to heel in the turn, oopsie, over she went, right? Um,
I'd I'd say, Dan, that's
completely
a fair,
preventable. Completely preventable.
completely completely preventable. And I think it's beneficial to take one step back before they got there. If you I watched a really good documentary on the Golden Ray recently, and I was reminded of that Hurricane Dorian had just passed through that area, and the vessel was delayed quite a bit, and getting to where it was going. And I'm not the expert on. I didn't do the Marine Casualty Board of report or whatever from the Coast Guard or the NTSB, but I think that they had opportunities to take on ballast water prior to even being in the river, and so I think that was a mistake that was made, that was identified. Yeah, you're correct. They got underway. There was nobody checked the work of the chief mate, for the load calculations. So again, preventable. Something I know that company has worked hard to incorporate into their standard operating procedures now. Um, but that case, when the call came in, um, our first concern was life, and the 24 people on board. And I would say, without skipping over that, I think one of the key decisions that the unified command made in that case, in that incident, was to actually phase the incident. And because you had to successfully get through one phase while you were planning for the next. Because if you looked at the problem set, as big as it was, we couldn't be worried about the removal of the wreck until we saved the lives at sea. We couldn't be worried about taking all the oil off the vessel until we had, stabilized and secured the source, and then actually worked to clean up and put boom and prevent oil from going from one water area, one waterway to another area. So I think that was a key decision the unified command made at an early time in there that set us up for success throughout the response.
Yeah, there were, I don't remember how many people trapped inside the hull, and it was quite a heroic rescue, cutting through the hull and getting in to get those people out. And that phase went on for over 72 hours, if I recall. I mean, it was quite a while. You could hear people pounding on the hull. The crew had managed to work their way up to a point in the hull where they could make some noise and identify their location, which helped rescuers zero in on them.
Well, I think absolutely, and I think it was just shy of 40 hours from the time that we got the Mayday call till we were able to extract the last person from the engineering control room, down in the engine room. And I think it just speaks to the cooperation across the board that no entity can do it alone. And the U.S. Coast Guard has for over 230 some years now, has been doing search and rescue, but we don't have specialized equipment to cut into the hulls of ships. Um, the U.S. has laws that require non-tank vessel response plans, but those non-tank vessel response plans are only as good as the qualified individual, the salvage marine firefighting specialist, the oil spill removal organizations, and their ability to work together. And so, for me, sitting here in a slightly different color blue shirt with Gallagher Marine Systems now than what I was wearing back then, I couldn't say enough about how Gallagher um, served as the responsible party incident commander and the cooperation that we achieved from the very, very beginning of that case, of that incident. With common goals, not just the objectives and priorities and limitations and constraints and all of that that we do when we do the incident command system and establish an incident management team, but just from the relationships that we were able to establish and foster early on, and then allow those to carry through. And at the incident commander level in the unified command, we knew that we needed to be united. That didn't mean we had to agree all the time. In fact, we disagreed often vehemently at times on how to proceed. But when we left the unified command room, we were a united front, and we knew that that was going to make sure that our SCAT teams, who had a Coast Guard member, a Gallagher or a OSRO member, and a state representative, were going to have seen a united front at our level, and they were going to be united. They were out looking for oil and picking up and cleaning up oil. So I have a lot to say on this case, but I'd rather you prompt me with questions. Otherwise, I'll get stuck in a rabbit hole that I don't want to go down.
I I I get it. Well, let's talk about when you first formed a unified command. When you first walked through the door, who did you find on scene, and what was that initial UC meeting like? Was it easy? Was it contentious? Give us a an image into that.
Well, so I think to say the official first unified command meeting, you got to take a quick step back and go. There was a convergence of various things that were going on. Then the Coast Guard has a whole search and rescue system that was fully activated on this. So we had what's termed a search and rescue mission coordinator. We also, given that this was in a port, we also had a captain of the port who controls the waterways and has the to open or close waterways. We had a state on scene coordinator from Georgia who is very much intricately involved in spill response across the state, but you also had a director of the coastal area there, who reported to a different chain of command at the state. So I think, as in any response, sometimes it's very, very clear exactly where the authorities lie. But for us, I think we had more people in the unified command in the very beginning, till we realized, okay, this is going to be a search and rescue phase is past. We've established a waterways group, to work the waterways with the captain of the port authorities. And we had the federal on scene coordinator, the state on scene coordinator, and the responsible party incident commander really formed the unified command that we would carry through from about the 40th hour on until I think well over day 500 in the response overall. So um, a little bit of chaos at the beginning, just like there is. I think any organization that's trying to form goes through the forming, the storming, the norming, the performing phases of that. But I think quickly, those Coast Guard entities that were involved recognized that Chris Graff, as the responsible party incident commander, was who we needed to be going through, and that Chris was representing the shipping company, was representing the P&I club. And once we knew where our one source of entry was into the responsible party side of things, that made our jobs a lot easier on to who we had to communicate with. And I think Chris would say that once he knew who the sole authority was for the Coast Guard, then he didn't have to worry about everybody else. We worried about that internally, Coast Guard, whereas he could worry about his briefing timelines to the shipping company, and to the client overall.
We have really three phases of this, as I see it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we have the search and rescue life safety phase, and
Correct.
that ended when all of the crew was finally accounted for. Now we
That's
have the
correct.
salvage phase, because at this moment, it's still a ship, right? There's still hope that we can right this ship, that we can save this ship. And then eventually it becomes a wreck removal phase, right? So let's talk about the salvage phase. When you still when you still saw it as a ship and not debris, um,
Yeah.
how did that go?
Well, I think at that point we were really trying to look at this as you would most spills overall, and our primary focus was to secure the source, and it was to stop the spread of oil, throughout the rest of the waterway, and we really had to work hard on those two pieces of it, and then communicating with experts really from around the world. I mean, this was in some responses internal to the U.S., we'll say it's a whole of government response, but really in this case, it was a whole of the salvage world response, and we had experts, who were consulting with us. We had the supervisory of salvage for the Navy was lending us expertise. We had Coast Guard engineers from the Marine Safety Center who were coming together, as well as experts in the shipping industry as well, who were weighing in to try to let us know, are we going to be able to right this ship? Is this ship going to be able to be turned back up from laying down on its port side? And are we going to be able to get it up to where we could either, and I liken this to what they've done up in Baltimore here recently, where they were finally able to take the bridge sections off. However, they did it with explosions and other removal tactics. With the dolly case, they were able to take that vessel back to the pier, and they're going to be able to salvage it in whatever manner that looks like. For the Golden Ray, by the middle of October, by my recollection, the insurance companies and those who were the decision makers for them with the ownership group had determined that this was going to be what's termed a catastrophic total loss, and that's really when we had to make a transition from the salvage to an actual wreck removal. So um, obviously, as a unified command, um, at the time I was hearing that this is an unprecedented shipwreck in U.S. waters. I had known of other. I think it was the Tricolor, was a car carrier that capsized and had lost some cars off of the coast of England. But for us, in the United States, having a vessel of this magnitude, of this size, capsize at the entrance to the second largest roll on roll off port in the country, we realized that we are going to be in it for the long haul. At the time, we only had one way ship traffic going by it with tug escorts, and we were worried about the safety of the responders first and foremost. As you might imagine, people going inside, we were trying to remove oil, any amount of oil that we could. We had divers in the engine room, hot tapping tanks, the service and settling tanks in the engine room. We were cutting into the vessel to access other tanks to be able to remove as much oil as we possibly could. And when you have an operation of that scale going on, the Unified Command's top priority was safety overall.
That would have really made me nervous if I was in the unified command to have people doing that kind of work. I mean, no amount of safety plan or safety brief can account for everything in those kind of situations. That's really scary.
It is, Dan, but I'm reminded of the tailgate safety briefs that are conducted at responses all around the country, all around the world. And you're right, you can't fully account for all the issues, all the hazards, all the perils, even as we tried. But sometimes just that reminder of every morning, and I didn't make it every morning, but I made it multiple times a week to the various tailgate safety meetings. They started underneath the Sydney Lanier Bridge, the US 17 crosses, and that's where we launched out of when the team went out. We had it during daylight hours only because it was complicated enough to be doing what they were doing inside the hull of a ship, rather than be doing it during nighttime. Although we did do some nighttime operations later on, and the wreck removal, the chain cutting, and times like that. Early on, while we were still trying to remove oil from this wreck, we conducted daylight only, operations on the site of the casualty.
So, Matt, how was the decision made to go out of the salvage phase and into the wreck removal phase? Who decides that it's a wreck and that we're not going to salvage the ship anymore?
Well, Dan, I'll tell you, that was a complicated time. As we were working through that, and there's been shipwrecks in the U.S. and around the world before, but I think every I mean, you have a lot more spill experience than I do, and I think we would both agree that everyone's different. They follow a lot of similarities, but everyone is unique in its own right. And in this particular one, where it was block, limiting to one-way traffic in the second largest railroad port in the country, certainly weighed into that. The proximity, in Georgia to impacts of the state economy on tourism, on beaches, on the ecosystem, right where it was in St. Simon's Island, Jekyll Island, Sea Island, some very prominent beach vacation areas for Georgians and others across the southeast. There was a whole lot of pressure points coming in from all levels of the government, of the media, of the public, of environmental interest groups. And certainly the Unified Command felt a pressure point. We wanted to get this done as quick as we could, but we wanted to get it done as safely as we could as well. And so between September when this all began and really through the months of October and November, a lot of time and energy was spent consulting with experts around the world, salvage experts, salvage masters who had worked other cases. Certainly, the Salvage Marine Firefighting Company, who was on site working, doing outstanding work with us right there in the salvage group of the Unified Command. Their experts weighed in. But ultimately, once the vessel was determined to be constructive total loss, which ultimately that decision, was made, by the insurance company, by the P&I club, because they're the ones ultimately gonna foot the bill, right? And I learned more about insurance and hull and machinery insurance and cargo insurance, and ultimately the big umbrella being the P&I clubs. I learned there was only about 20 of them in the whole world, and the company we were working with was certainly looking at all things safety, all things environment, but having to take a look at the realities of removing something as safely and as efficiently as could be done. Um, like in most things where you have experts involved, not everybody agrees on the exact way to do something. In the Unified Command, we took an awful lot of briefs from an awful lot of people, who had their thoughts about how we should do it. There was case history involved about other wreck removals and in particular wreck removals with car carriers, roll on roll off ships. But it came down to fundamentally, do you do it in small section or do you do it in large section? And meaning in a smaller section, smaller scale, you cut smaller pieces, you remove them piece by piece, and you do so with stability calculations to ultimately get yourself to where you can remove that wreck. And then there was a lot of talk about large scale, large section demolition and being able to cut the vessel and remove it in sections. 6 sections, 8 sections, 10 sections. You know, um, the math and the stability calculations would tell us which way to go there. Um, Collectively, the decision was made to go with large section demolition, with the caveat from both really the insurance company, but also the state of Georgia was highly interested in minimizing, even limiting the amount of the cars that might fall out of any type of demolition and removal. And so an environmental protection barrier was also decided upon as a means to try to keep not only pollutants, like oil or other toxins that might float on the water, from escaping into the environment, but also preventing larger sections of metal, of cars, of pieces of the ship that might fall into the water during the cutting, and being able to keep them contained in an area that would provide a more expeditious removal of those things. So yeah, it was as I think back to October, November, December of 2019 and the decision making process, it was collective in nature. We had academia, weighing in on stuff. We had environmental groups. We tried our best to be very, very transparent with absolutely everybody involved, so they would recognize that there is no singular right way to do something, and when it's unprecedented and what you have to do, the challenge you have to surmount is unprecedented. So we were very calculating, very collaborative, and ultimately stand by the decision that was made to do large section demolition.
That environmental protection barrier, I think, was the first of its kind to be
That's correct.
deployed. It was quite a structure. Can you describe that and how it was designed and installed?
Yeah, so as part of the process where other companies started looking at like, how might they attack the problem, it became very clear, you know, to all of us in Unified Command that an environmental protection barrier of some sort was necessary no matter what we did. The currents that flow out of Altamaha Sound there into St. Simon Sound, particularly on the ebb tide, when the current is running out, are 5, 6, 7 knots, and those are probably most people who listen to this are mariners and understand the nautical side of things, but that is a heavy force of water that is flowing outbound, and it all funnels to one area. So whereas you can think, oh, it won't make a car float, if you even just take a look at like some swiftwater rescues you see during hurricane responses around this country, or when a vessel enters a river, and or I'm sorry, a car enters a river, that force of water is going to move it. And if we can't track where it goes, which we knew we weren't going to be able to do, we were going to have a problem that's going to lead out into the Atlantic Ocean. It would potentially, lead to further reductions on shipping in the waterway in and out of the port of Brunswick. And so the environmental protection barrier was constructed to basically have in place um, large sections that could capture anything larger. And I forget the exact dimensions of it, if it was 5 by 5 feet or what have you. But it was sections that were going to stay in the water to protect any or prevent anything from leaving the EPB area during cuts. But we were also going to have a finer mesh we were going to be able to put down during periods of extensive cutting going on. And that would, in theory, our goal was to allow marine life to flow back and forth as they normally would during the larger sections. But we acknowledged we were taking on some more risk to that marine life. But during periods of cutting, we wanted the added protection of having even finer a finer barrier down there to prevent the outflow of contaminants, cars, pieces of metal, etc.
It seemed pretty effective. So how many sections did you ultimately end up cutting this ship into? Do you recall?
So Dan, I believe it was 8 sections. And I probably should have said this in the beginning, but I was there mainly from September of 2019 till about February of 2020. One of my last acts as the Federal On Scene Coordinator for the Coast Guard was to go up to Georgia, up to Atlanta, Georgia, to brief the governor and his cabinet on our plans, our actions, where we were going moving forward. As I believe you and probably most of the listeners know, the construction of the environmental protection barrier and the actual cutting of the golden ray didn't take place until much later into 2020, even into early 2021 overall. So I was not there for the full construction of the EPB, nor the cuts. So that's something I've had to watch other shows and watch other documentaries to see that, and how that all played out.
Well, you probably wouldn't want to be there for the whole thing. I don't know what your health would be like if you had gone the whole thing.
Right.
Uh, I think Chris Graff took 6 months vacation after it was over just to decompress.
Yeah, no doubt. And I mean, and the thousands upon thousands of responders who were there over the course of, the 2+ year evolution, you know, um, their contributions can't be thanked enough. They each filled a very specific role, and I don't even going through a global pandemic. I wasn't there. I had gone on to my the job I retired out of as the sector commander for Coast Guard Sector North Carolina at that point when COVID really took off. But I did stay in touch with Chris. And with Tom Weicker, our president, and with Kevin Perry, our vice president of emergency management here at Gallagher, and the challenges that they continue to face throughout that. I just got to say, I think the safety record for that entire response, as managed by Gallagher, by the United States Coast Guard, by the state of Georgia, and the countless salvers and oil spill removal organizations and their workers, it's a very impressive track record for the lack of injuries, the lack of COVID impacts overall to carry out the largest shipwreck removal in the United States history.
Well, then you decided when you retired to go into the private sector and keep doing response. what are you doing now? And how can we get in touch with you if we want your help?
Well, Dan, I had to take a little bit of time off after the Coast Guard too. I worked at a large grain farm here in southeastern North Carolina and kind of got back to my roots. I did not supervise anybody. I did not take any after hours calls or have to answer emails, and that was quite therapeutic and quite frankly emotionally necessary. Um, but Gallagher Marine Systems, is in the response world as a whole. One of the things I've been drawn to by them is the family nature. And I think Gallagher has a true family bond amongst its members, not just those who are full time employees, but with those who we work with. And that's how I saw Tom, Kevin, and Chris Graff lead during the Golden Ray response. And so I had talked to some people. Steve Garcia, my current boss, is the director of emergency response, about potential employment, but it had to work out at the right time. And fortunately, the right time was just a couple weeks ago, and I'm now the deputy director of emergency response for Gallagher. I'm the response manager for the southeastern part of the state, which I'm fortunately very familiar with North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia time. I'm learning Florida and Alabama as well. Um, but yeah, I was drawn to the Gallagher team because I saw how they treated people with courtesy, dignity, and respect. I saw how they treated one another as a family. Um, and families, they can disagree too. We don't all have to sit in a circle and sing kumbaya and agree all the time. But I liked how Gallagher considered other people's perspectives and opinions, to ultimately make the best decision they could for the safety of the responders, but also in the best interest of their clients as well. So that's kind of what led me back into this response world.
Well, that's great to hear. I've always found that what you say with Gallagher and their family culture is true. Well, Matt Baer, now Deputy Director of Emergency Management for Gallagher, thank you for taking the time to share your experiences with us today.
Hey, Dan, thanks again for having me. And if I could just leave kind of one nugget, I would just, throw out there to your listeners is there's a saying I wish I was smart enough to have come up with it, but never exchange business cards in a crisis. I think that's good practice to know those people who you're going to be working with. And it's impossible to know everybody, but I'll tell you that I sat for 2 weeks at a table at Coast Guard Training Center, Yorktown, Virginia, in June of 2019 with a gentleman by the name of Kevin Perry. We sat across from each other. We were in the class together for 2 weeks. It was the on-scene crisis communications course and the Coast Guard Incident Commander course. And Kevin and I got to know each other very, very well. And who would have thought that 3 months later, we would be involved together in one of the world's largest shipwreck removal cases ever. So anytime you take with somebody and you spend to get to know them, get to know a little bit about them, you never know when it's going to pay dividends. So I just would encourage people to network. uh, I call it remembering the triangle, but like remembering the name, the face, and the organization. Some people say they're really good with names, some people say they're really good with faces. I think the challenge for those of us in the emergency response world is to try to connect all three of those dots. And then the fourth connection point is having their contact info ready to call at a moment's notice, because none of these things ever happen whenever we're all ready and we're all just sitting around waiting for a response. They all happen at the least opportune time. So it's best to know as many of your potential teammates as you possibly can before you go into that incident response. So, but Dan, thanks again very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk and listen and to share.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for coming on the show.